Just to give you kind of a background into this, I'm not going to be getting into the details of the weeds. I know some had asked about, biosketches, all of that. This is a little bit more, it was a talk that I gave previously, and I thought it would fit just a little bit more of what are sort of some of the perspectives that reviewers may have. And this is really coming from my own experience and from, information that and opinions I've gathered from mentors and colleagues. And there are many people on the call that may have similar or even opposing opinions on this. So I'd love to hear all of those too. But the goal today is to kind of help you understand how your application would be coming through from a reviewer's lens. And I wanted to think more mentally about the mental models of how to prepare for this rather than the specifics or the mechanics. And I think the important thing to come across, at least from my experience, is that successful grant writing, successfully funded grants, is not just science alone. Obviously, that has to be there, but I think it also is so much dependent on how reviewers interpret your proposal. And that's a good thing because that means that there's an aspect of that we can potentially control and address. And importantly, I think small changes in grantsmanship, these aren't really the things I'll be bringing up are not, dramatically new innovative things. They're really sort of well-known, tried and true kind of approaches that can potentially dramatically, I think, change outcomes on grants. Next slide. So, when I think about how I review grants and how reviewers actually review grants, these were kind of the four major things that I came up with. And the first is not to say we don't read your grants. Reviewers obviously have to read grants and we have to go through them. But I think what's important is in the best of all worlds, and I think I feel this way still, even though several of us may have gotten that one review or three that just seems really a little bit ornery and angry. Most reviewers are looking for a reason to fund your projects. They want to like it. They get excited about great science. And when they see something that's interesting, it's easy to read. You want to keep going. So I think the important thing to think of is people are generally on your side, right? And they really want to be able to get on the same page. And so you almost have to, in this process, justify why you wouldn't. And for any reviewers out there, you probably agree, like it's so much harder to review grants with a lot of problems, and looking at everything and documenting it creates confusion, right? And then that confusion creates cognitive overload. You get a little cranky and then your score reflects that, right? So I think there's things that can really be helpful in the confusion and cognitive overload things, and I'll talk about some of those, but confusion creates risk, right? We don't like to see grants that are confusing because then we're starting to look for things and then we start identifying things that may or may not be there. So I think having clean, articulate grants is important. And I think the only way to really get at this and determine whether or not yours is confusing is you have to have people reading them. And you have to have other individuals, maybe not even in your science directly, but have people take a look, read your aims, read your grants, because it has to come across to people who may or may not be in your field. And I think that can be a real useful tool. And again, cognitive overload, think about how much you're putting on a page. Is it, easy to read? Are you using every single space in the thing and the margins are so narrow that the words are almost falling off the page? Are you underlining and bolding everything? That's not always easy to take in. And so, I've been learning over the years, because I started out that way, but I've been learning over the years, lots of white space, lots of clean pages. Make it easy for people to read what's on your grants. And then again, this is all getting to the point where how much work are you asking of the reviewers? Obviously, we all know it's hard to do this. Many of us are saying no to reviews. We've done the paper reviews for journals. It's hard to take on reviews for grants because it's a lot of work. And so I think you have to recognize that people are taking extra time and they're using their time to do this for you. And so you don't want them to work very hard. And that's the kind of mindset I try and get into when I'm starting the project and starting to write grants. Next slide. And so I think important to think about is that I don't think grants are just written. You don't start on page one and you go all the way to page, 12 with all of the other things in between. They're engineered. You're going back and forth. You're thinking about things in different stages and in different timelines. And what you want to do is really think about this as a process of, the fact that it's a project and it's going to have lots of, nuances that you're moving in and out of. I think it's important to be thoughtful in how you engineer it. So, design your grant not necessarily for deep reading for scan behavior. And that's controversial, but what I mean by that is we are reading them as a reviewer. However, the something that I do is you get usually 2 to 3 grants whenever you're doing a study section, sometimes more. And I usually take the month or so before, and you're reading them at your own pace, maybe one, per day, making notes, going through everything. And then every time I've had this, and this especially when it's been in person, you sit in your hotel room the night before after dinner, you're putting them all out. I'm skimming them at that point, taking a look at my notes, looking at the highlights again. Did I miss anything? Reminding myself. And your grant should be amenable to that, right? And if you don't have these strong sort of headers and strategic visual guides or repetition, it's kind of hard to be getting those messages at that time of day and night, right? And those are things that we want to be able to remember. So I think that you want to be able to write so that your message is clear. It's repeated. I think it's okay to repeat messages. It keeps people on track. Keep reminding your reviewers, why are you doing this? Why is this important? What does this go back to and reinforce? And I think writing with confidence. And I think that's going to be really important. You don't want the tone to reflect that you yourself are, not sure if this is going to be the best version, what you can do. And I kind of put these 2 specific games pages side by side to kind of give you a sense of how just visual clarity and, a clean page can look like. So the left-hand side is what I'm proposing, right? A little bit more white space. You're only highlighting the 3 major aims. Maybe there's some bullets. You're really just kind of keeping it simple, but your eye goes to those 3 aims. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's not clear what's actually important. And you do see grants like this sometimes. And this is what's interesting is that there's a fear of people not seeing what's important and then unfortunately they do too much of it and then we don't actually see what's important. So, being really thoughtful of how clean is your grant, how much space is there, are you actually highlighting what are the most important strategic valuables in your grant? I think that's really important. Next slide. And I will say, it's interesting. This is something I came across when I first wrote my first 2 grants, and I did get the feedback. Someone looked at my aims and was like, what is this? There's way too many italics, way too many bold statements, way too many underlines. I don't know what's actually important. And I kind of went back and tried to clean it up, be a little bit more clean. And I found a textbook where I really liked the formatting and I just copied it. And I started copying this format. And then one of my mentors saw one of my proposals and said, I really like your formatting. Can I use that? I'm like, yeah, use it. And then about a year later, I was sitting in study section and 3 grants came through with that exact same formatting. And I knew it was my original formatting because this came from this, you know, 1988 textbook of biostatistics. I wasn't, I'm pretty sure no one else is reading that the way it is. But the fact is that people appreciate it. It was easy to read and then it gets adopted. So then I knew, okay, I think this is what's going to work. And so my grants are pretty consistent. I use that same type of formatting. I use the same structure and use the same, strategy on what do I bold, what do I highlight, what do I, underline. So one thing that one important piece I think is, and I'm sure all of you have heard this, is if you're going to think about what the most important part of a grant is, to me, it's a specific aims page. I really do think this is a score driving component of the grant. I often, and many of us in our division, because we help read and work on each other's grants, we spend the most of our time on the specific aims page. I spend a good deal, maybe almost 50% of my grant writing time is on this page, making sure that it's clear and that it reflects what I want it to do, that it's understandable to others. And then that's my roadmap. to the rest of the grant. But this page is so, I think, so important. And as a reviewer, it's incredibly important because this is what I go to first and what sets the stage of what's going on. So a lot of times, I kind of already forming a preliminary score based on the aims itself, thinking, okay, is this innovative? Is this cool? Do they make sense? And then the rest of the application is either going to confirm or, oppose what I think the specific aims represents. And so I think it's important that you spend the time on this particular page. I also think there's a couple, there's always some feedback, and I've gotten some feedback on both sides of it. You don't want too many aims. This can't be, again, a messy page. Obviously, most of us think of 2 to 3 aims in a typical grant. I also think that they should be conceptually driven in terms of what's the question you're answering. I kind of use this as an example when we sit across the table with all of our research fellows and we say, okay, what are you working on? What's fascinating to me is, and this can be an intimidating space. We have our chair and our associate chairs for research and all these people. We're very successful sitting in the room, and there's a lot of pressure to say, well, I'm going to do, a hierarchical mixed methods, approach to this, and I'm going to model it using this. And my feedback is we don't need the models. The models are downstream. I mean, the methods will follow. What's the question you're answering? And what's the justification for asking that question? So I feel like the aims really need to be conceptually driven. The methods will support, answering that question. But I think that's what you want to really be thinking of is, the aim should follow a particular sense of scientific, inquisition. Okay. And then again, if your aims are unclear, nothing downstream, I think, can rescue. A bad aims page is a bad way to start, at least for me. All right, next page. So I think also having been on the other side and having written plenty of grants, but also reviewing grants, I think a good approach is to sort of think about reducing the reviewer anxiety. Okay, it's not your job to do this, but I think it works on your behalf, where you want to be able to think about how is your grant being, interpreted and perceived, and what's the burden you're placing on that reviewer to understanding your science and your approach. In a way, it's almost like a risk management document, right? You're trying to signal to them, how useful is this right now? Why is it a really good question? Why are the methods I'm proposing appropriate for what I'm saying? So you got to signal that feasibility pretty early. You want to think about the weaknesses ahead of time, justify why this is the right approach. One feedback as an epidemiologist that I get a lot, and I hear this a lot, especially in the clinical space, is, descriptive studies. Descriptive is like almost like a bad word in clinical research, and I see that a lot. It's like, well, it's just a descriptive study. Well, descriptive studies have their place, and they're actually really, really important when there's very little data and science and understanding of a clinical entity. And it's a necessary antecedent before you get to all the really cool, fun clinical trials and cohort studies and all that kind of stuff. But you can preempt someone's thought process by just saying, here's why this is needed. So that has to be upfront and clear that you're actually addressing some of these concerns so that you head them off before the reviewers think of them and use them against you. And then, of course, with preliminary data, you just want to show what's your prior momentum, what's your capability. Next slide. So I think of these, so when you think about like notice of awards, RFAs, or specific announcements that come, I think these are really wonderful opportunities for especially young, grant writers to try and address. I mean, it's a really good place to maybe put in your application where maybe there's some funds set aside or a particular programmatic interest that you think could fit. I like to use the review criteria sort of scoring instructions, so mirror the language that you would expect to see. So when you want it, innovation and impact is all going to be important. Talk very directly about what the innovation impact, spell it out so that the reviewer's not looking for it. You highlight what the innovation is there. Then it's really more of thinking, do I agree or disagree, rather than trying to dig for it. And I think it's really important, if you do have an RFA, if you do have a program announcement, align your narratives to that funding announcement. And I think it's incredibly important that you point that out. I actually put this on the specific aims page. You go through sort of the rationale, here's the background, here are the important questions. The completion of the aims are directly in line with the following funding announcement that is hoping to do X, Y, and Z. And now our grant is going to be able to do that. I think making the responsiveness obvious is really important, again, because you're not making the reviewers hunt to see, does this fit, does it not fit? And so I think it's really, really important. And I think strong grants read as inevitables, right? You have a funding announcement and a really strong grant, you're going to be like, oh, yeah, this is what this announcement was made for, right? And that's how you want it to be able to come across. Next slide. So I was asked to do this was I was asked to present sort of a timeline, and one of our seminars asks all of their investigators to come in and provide their timelines. Now, I did this many years ago. I think it was in 2021, so it's been a while. And what I noticed on all of their timelines is they kind of talk through, when did I get promoted? What were the different tasks I did? Did I win any awards? And then they had all these bolded green highlights of all their grants that they got funded. And just like your CV, it looks phenomenal. It looks impressive. You see all these green, lines, looks like there's a lot of grants. And what I didn't see, which is what I put on here, is all the red lines, which is all of the unfunded applications, all of the additional things that you tried for and you didn't get. At least for me, and I'd love to get feedback on others, I have at least 3 times, if not 4 times as many written unfunded grants as I have funded grants. And I think that's important. The key is we're writing. You're constantly writing and you're putting your ideas out there. You're getting feedback. I don't think the success is just getting the grants. It's how many times do you take shots on goal and put yourself out there and learn from it and put something across that eventually is successful. And I think, and I put here, looks like a lot less red lines, but if you look at them, it's like 3 grants in 2006 that I wrote that didn't get funded. In 2003, I wrote 2 grants that didn't get funded. Again, another 2 in 2015, 2 in 2021. I just wrote 2, and so there's a lot of grants that you write that don't make it across the finish line. But all of those 2, 3, 4, 5 attempts did eventually, in many cases, not all, but in some cases, lead to successful opportunities. And so I think it's important that don't get frustrated. I think this is the process, and we have to accept that this is really the process. And we have a careers fair where we have people talk about the choices they made, and this is in the school of public health. Did you go into academics? Did you go into industry? Did you go into not-for-profit? And why did you make the decisions? And I am hearing a lot from PhDs, from clinicians who don't want to go into research, and the first response is, well, it's just so hard to get funded. And the fact of the matter is that even at that time, and relatively speaking, we didn't know that there was going to be a difference, but even that time, it felt like it was a lot to get funded. But the choice of going into the field was not about whether or not you get funded or how hard it is, but how much do you like writing grants? And how much do you like going through this process? I had this conversation with a colleague, like those days when you got to get a specific aims page started. I mean, I love those days. All the meetings are set aside. You get in your sweat, pants, and you get in your office and you get your coffee and you sit down and you start thinking about that really cool project. That's actually fun. And most people I talk to, they like that part of it and they like that aspect. Obviously, there's nuances to everything that you do, but you have to enjoy the process in order for this to feel like there's going to be some long-term success and sustenance to the career. Last slide. Yeah, and so the final takeaways, and again, these were very high level, so I wanted to be able to stop and just have discussions on this, but I think it's important that you think about the fact that most funded grants are not just funded because they're scientifically strong. There's lots of grants that are scientifically strong that don't get funded for lots of different reasons. But I do think that most of them are very strategically constructed to be able to tell their story and tell it well. I think clarity is incredibly important. And I think it's even more important than your brilliance because you could have a great idea and just be terrible at trying to project it. I think reviewers also think about trajectories, not just projects. So when I look at something, especially with the early stage investigators, how is this going to lead to their career? Is this a really good step? How many other questions may come from the answering of these studies or the completion of these studies that could help this individual, continue? And I think that's an important way to think about what you're doing. What pathway of science is this taking you on? And is this sort of reflected in how you're thinking about it and writing about it? Um, Reduce uncertainty. Again, make feasibility unmistakable. And even if that means you got to literally write it out. And I copied this from another grant writer on the specific case page. I started writing on the bottom, impact, bolded, capitalized, and then with, a sentence afterwards, here's the impact, right? Because I didn't want people to miss the impact. And so that's one way of doing it. But what are the ways, think about the ways that you could potentially do some of those things. And again, lastly, and I've said this before, strong grants just feel inevitable. You start reading it and you're like, okay, this is going to be important to finish and it's going to be important to get funded. And that kind of jumps out at you right away.